very good evening to all of you. I am Sarthak Bagchi, and I welcome you to the seminar and lecture series at the School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. Today's is a very special seminar and lecture series event, as the subject of today's lecture is a great Indian nationalist leader, Dadabhai Naoroji. And at a time when nationalism is being contested, is being debated, who is a nationalist and who is not a nationalist, we are having different kind of tags being thrown at historical figures about who was right and who was wrong. This is a very important point in time to reflect and to understand the nuances and understand the complexities of the historical figures that we have had and that we have seen, who have shaped our India's independence movement and India's the journey of nationalism in India. So we could not have asked for anybody better than today's speaker, Dr. Dinya Patel, for enlightening us and throwing insights on the life and career of such a great Indian nationalist leader. For today's lecture, we have with us a student from the undergraduate program, a third-year student of history, Nishita Mandhava, who will be introducing today's speaker for all of you. And with that, I welcome all of you to this seminar and lecture series event. And I hope that you will be all enjoying and learning a lot of insights from today's lecture. Nishita, over to you.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dinyar Patel. Dr. Dinyar Patel is an assistant professor of history at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai. He is also affiliated to the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. Prior to his move to Mumbai, Dr. Patel has taught in the Department of History at the University of South Carolina. He received his PhD in history from Harvard University in 2015. His biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, titled Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism, was published by Harvard University Press in May 2020. He teaches courses on modern South Asia, the Indian nationalist movement, and the British Empire. Most of his research has focused on the life and career of Dadabhai Naoroji, arguably one of the most significant Indian nationalist leaders before Gandhi. Besides this, his research also focuses on the Indian nationalist movement, the city of Mumbai, and the Parsi Zoroastrian community. Dr. Patel is the recipient of 2 Fulbright fellowships and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities for his research. In addition to academic writing, he also regularly writes for esteemed popular publications, including the BBC News, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times Online, The Hindu, The Indian Express, and The Scroll. It gives us great pleasure to welcome him today to Ahmedabad University and learn more insights about the life and times of Dadabhai Naoroji from Dr. Dinyar Patel. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Nishita, and to Sarthak for those introductions. I really appreciate it, and it's great to know that we have undergrad students also on this call. So I will be giving a PowerPoint presentation also. The topic of my talk obviously is Naoroji the person, but I have 3 questions which kind of round out the talk. I mean, one was, two of them relate to Naoroji's picture, Naoroji's role in the larger stream of, say, nationalism and politics in India and Great Britain, in the sense of how Naoroji was able to be elected as an Indian to the British Parliament as early as 1892, and how Naoroji's career relates to the beginning of Indian nationalism. But the third question is, again, particular, I think, to many of your interests at Ahmedabad University, in the sense that Naoroji was obviously someone who grew up in a Gujarati-speaking community, a Parsi, and he was from Bombay, and he had extensive familial and business and political links throughout Gujarat. So, to what degree did Gujarat and the Gujarati-speaking world shape Naoroji's career as well? So that's a third question which I'll be addressing today. Now, The book that I've written was published last year. It covers the life of this individual who does not get much attention right now. I mean, you see someone who obviously is nowhere near as politically useful as, say, a Tilak or a Savarkar or what have you. I mean, he belongs to a generation of people like Gokhale and Ranade who were pretty incredible in their day time, but were summarily quickly forgotten. And one of the reasons I wanted to embark on this book was to highlight the importance of such individuals and also kind of take them out of a Victorian mold. And express their ideas and contributions, keeping in mind the longer arc of Indian nationalism and also where India is today in terms of the political climate. So Naoroji is perhaps best known to most people for one or two or three things, right? I mean, the sense that people know that he wrote this book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. And I actually spend very little time talking about the book in my own book, because Poverty and Un-British Rule is actually a compilation of many of his different writings. So I kind of take them apart bit by bit rather than looking at the book in general. And the second big thing that he's really known for is the fact that he won election to the British Parliament in 1892 and became what was known as the first Indian member of the British Parliament. Now, of course, there were a few people before him who had part Indian descent who were elected to the British Parliament, but he's undoubtedly the first individual who identified as an Indian, politically, culturally, nationally. And so it's a significant moment. And especially from the standpoint of study of the broader British Empire, a moment when social Darwinist ideas were so strong, when racism was so pervasive everywhere. How can an Indian be elected, right, from a constituency right at the heart of the British Empire? And what was this Indian doing right, walking right within the halls of power at the center of the British Empire? How was this possible? So I'm going to take you through a few facets of his career. I'll be working relatively chronologically, and we'll be jumping around geographically between places like Bombay, other parts of India, and Great Britain. So this will be, geographically expansive as well as chronologically as well. Now, Naoroji had his roots, again, in this Gujarati-speaking world. And if you go to Navsari, just down the road, just pretty much halfway between where you and I are, you will see a house called the Naoroji birthplace in an old Parsi Vad in Navsari. It's one of the few old surviving houses in this particular area. It's been partially renovated. That's a whole other story, but it's undoubtedly old. We don't know the precise links with Naoroji. It's described again as being the birthplace of Dadabhai Naoroji. That's incorrect, because Naoroji himself talks about how he was born in Bombay. It probably is somehow related to his paternal family. Because we know that his parents migrated from the area around Navsari and Dharampur just prior to his birth, so maybe around 1823, 1824, 1825, and his family had long links in Navsari. They were members of a Parsi family, which was priestly, and therefore, due to these priestly fetish or family trees, you can actually trace back his ancestry quite a long time. I mean, hundreds of years. So, this family tree, which was done in the 1920s, you can trace lineage all the way back to the Mughal era. You see Naoroji's name highlighted over there. So the family was moored in southern Gujarati culture, the Parsi environment over there, Baroda, the Baroda princely state, since Navsari was a part of it, but they also had links with Dharampur, which was a much smaller princely state in Gujarat also. And we'll see throughout his life, these links play an important role. I mean, his family continues to have close relations with parts of Gujarat, which they had come from. Now, Naoroji was actually born, as I said, in Bombay. He was born in a place called Khadak. Khadak is a neighborhood that today is close by to Bhendi Bazaar. So I've put some modern landmarks on this map from 1855. It was a place radically different from Navsari, in the sense that it was cosmopolitan. His neighbors were not just Parsis, but also members of the Jewish community, Muslims, Hindus, members of different trading castes from Gujarat and different groups from across Maharashtra, as well as people really from across the subcontinent, as well as a lot of Britons who lived just north of him in the area of Baikala, and also had businesses to the south of him in Fort. So this is a very cosmopolitan environment in which he grows up in. And you see signs of it reflected in his education, the sense that, Naoroji began his education like many other Gujarati-speaking individuals in Bombay who were privileged enough to have an education, the sense that he went to a pathshala, where instruction was done in Gujarati. But at a relatively young age, his father died, and his mother decided to put him into an experiment in public school in Bombay, something run by an organization called the Bombay Native Education Society, which was a group of people, both Britons and Indians, who decided to get together, open a few schools where Gujarati, Marathi, and English were the media of instruction, and education was provided to worthy students for free. So this was a place where, people who were relatively rich, as well as people who were quite poor, mingled side by side in the classroom. And Naoroji was comparatively quite poor. The little information we have on his time as a school child talks about how, even, when he goes to school, he goes in torn clothes. His family comes from a much poorer part of the city. His father died, so there wasn't much family support. He apparently was even discriminated upon based on the fact that he came from a poor family. I mean, one or two of his British instructors would kind of point out the fact of his poverty. So, here you have a very early example of how public education was helping to level the playing field, so to speak, right? I mean, Naoroji as a Parsi was still relatively an elite, right? I don't want to compare him with other poor people in Bombay because that comparison doesn't work. But he was someone who did have definite disadvantages, and he felt a great deal of obligation, a great deal of debt that he had to repay for the fact that he had this opportunity to lift himself out of relative poverty and attend a school where he learned English, he learned British history, he learned British literature. This is stuff which was completely unavailable to other members of his family. And it translated into a college education at Elphinstone. Now, many of you know this particular building in Kalagoda. This was not the building that Naoroji attended as a college student. Elphinstone was located close by to what is today Dobichalao, the metro cinema area. But it was then, like it was up until relatively recently, one of the premier institutions in India, and definitely the premier educational institution in Western India. And here again, Naoroji, is an example of someone whose life is transformed by education. I mean, his instructors are Scotsmen, they are Irishmen, there are a few Indians who are teaching him as well. In general, they're quite progressive in their outlook toward India. So there's a very close collaborative relationship that you see here that you do not see in places like Calcutta, for example, between the students and the faculty. And this has a great influence on his ideas of how, say, Britons and Indians can cooperate together and what Indians can do in kind of a liberal political environment. Naoroji, by all accounts, was a polymath. He did very well in a variety of subjects. He was heir to a much longer kind of West Indian tradition of being a polymath. People like Naoroji Fardunji or others before him who were in the structures were also people who could teach in like Shakespeare in one class and calculus in another. And so, if you look at some of the earliest records that we have for Elphinstone, when Naoroji actually graduates and goes on to become a member of the teaching staff at Elphinstone, we can actually find the mathematics papers that he gives to his students. So, math papers that, you would have taken if you were a student of his. So, he was loved within the Elphinstone community because not only was he a student, but he eventually rejoins as a faculty member, and he eventually becomes the first Indian appointed as a full professor at Elphinstone, and therefore the first Indian appointed at a government-run college in India, which was, again, quite a big distinction. And he was doing this by the time he was around 29 years of age, which is phenomenal, obviously, even in our day, for those of us who are professors know. So, he had his academic career, but he also took a very strong interest in social and political activities. And one of the biggest social activities he was involved in during his early years in Elphinstone was female education. He was interested in promoting educational opportunities for women because, as we know, in this era, those opportunities were about nil, aside from, a few missionary institutions. It was not just the Parsi community where he was interested in promoting female education. He took part in organizational work where students who spoke Marathi or Gujarati, Hindu Gujaratis would attend these schools. So, this was something where he faced a great degree of opposition, but managed to get several hundred Parsi girls to attend schools by the 1850s or so. And he also immersed himself in a much broader world of those individuals who speak Gujarati. So, his activities in female education were having ramifications as far away as Ahmedabad. It encouraged people like the Nagar Shet of Ahmedabad to open a school. female education to start in Ahmedabad as well. And the other way which Naoroji communicated with a much broader Gujarati-speaking audience was through print, through the newspaper, the print economy of this era. He was an editor for a paper called Rasguftar, which started in 1851. This was a paper that was very reformist in orientation. It originally started off as being Parsi-centric, but expanded to include non-Parsis on its staff and expanded to include within its content, things of national importance. And it campaigned for economic reform, social reform, political reform, what have you. It did so in a way that was accessible to the poor. The first editions of this paper were actually subsidized. They were distributed for free. The first print run, as you can maybe see on this document, had 1,000 copies, which was phenomenal in this era. Right? I mean, Rasguftar might have become one of the highest circulating papers in India, all of India, by the 1870s or so, after Naoroji was out of the picture. So Naoroji is taking part in a much broader, community than just say the Parsis or Bombay-centric, things going on within Bombay itself. And it's apparent even, when you look at how Naoroji is described in different languages. I mean, this is from a journal that was affiliated with this larger project of female education, Tribodh. And you see that in English, he's described as, the grand old man of India, but in Gujarati is Sri Kelavni ane Sansar Sudarano Mahan Yota. This great kind of proponent or reformer, in charge of female education, and social upliftment. So in different languages, he's being described in different ways, which kind of, I think, gives you an indication of how, his reputation was burnished in a specific sense within the Gujarati-speaking world. So he became a part of this movement called Young Bombay, which had, the Gujarati-speaking world as a component, but also the, Marathi-speaking world, and also, much larger slice of Indian society, which was campaigning for elements of educational reform, social reform, getting rid of things like superstitious practices, and eventually political reform. I mean, he takes part in a Bombay society, which something called the Bombay Association, which was really kind of the first attempt at a modern political organization in this part of Western India. And they petition Parliament. They write about the need for reform. So his political career begins here in Bombay in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, let me transition to another aspect of his career, the aspect that follows thereafter. In the year 1855, Naoroji takes the rather fateful step of deciding to migrate to Great Britain in order to take up a position in a company with a few other Parsis working in London. And this trip to Europe, he travels by boat from Bombay through the Red Sea, from Aden to Cairo, Alexandria, Malta, Marseille, and onward from there to Paris and London. It's transformative because he sees parts of the world which, like Aden and Egypt, are poor, like India, and parts of the world like France and Great Britain, which are just astoundingly, unimaginably rich. If you look within what he describes to his readership in Rasguftar, he's still writing for Rasguftar at the stage. He's spellbound. Once he sees France and in Great Britain, he says, this is what we in India need to aspire to. So from an early era, again, we see a conscious understanding on Naoroji's part of the poverty that you face in a place like India and the incredible prosperity of a place like Paris or London or Liverpool. And this is highlighted, while Naoroji is abroad, through his involvement in the cotton industry. I mean, he's working in the larger cotton economy, and those of you who have read Sven Beckel's book Empire of Cotton know how India was a part of it, and how both positive and deeply negative ways it was impacted by this global cotton economy. And a lot of Naoroji's views built off his involvement in the cotton economy, seeing how India's fortunes were dragged and pulled depending on events like the American Civil War, which caused tremendous wealth and then tremendous poverty when the Civil War ended. And at the same time, he's also observing mass famine that's occurring in India. I mean, again, he's doing this at a distance, right? When he's in London, he travels occasionally back to India, to visit his family and such. But this is an era when the late 19th century is an era when, millions and millions of Indians died in these horrific famines, right? There's this famous book, Late Victorian Holocausts, which documents in part, the devastation of these famines. And Naoroji is observing them either from London or in person in Bombay. This is the basis for his work on poverty. Understanding, why India is going through these terrible things, famine, the vagaries of, the cotton economy. This is how he starts to really put together a lot of statistical work studying poverty. What he does really from the 1860s onward is try to answer a fundamental question. Why is India so poor? Why is it so poor in relation to Great Britain? And why is it seemingly getting poorer every year? This is, again, how Naoroji comes up with his idea of the drain theory, the idea that every year India is getting poorer and poorer, and that poverty is due to wealth being physically taken out of the country by the British. Now, as I said, this was an academic, kind of like an academic study. I mean, you saw the statistics on the previous page, and I mentioned that he was doing a lot of this work in London, but he also comes back to India. And when he goes to India, he goes on the ground, again, to places in Gujarat. You see in this article, he's talking, the newspaper is talking about how he's traveling to Kathiawar and Kutch and other parts of Gujarat, presumably Baroda, just to see what poverty is like, right? And examining conditions and talking to farmers. Throughout his academic work on poverty, you see that his references to, say, things like a farmer in Punjab, or someone who works in a mill in Bengal, or someone in Gujarat. So, it's not just dispassionate academic study based on statistics, it's also based on a lot of conversations with people whose lives are actually being affected by this process of impoverishment. And a lot of that came, again, through Gujarat. So Naoroji starts to put together a really damning set of statistics on, he makes the first attempt to calculate, the average income of an Indian. And he discovers that the average income of an Indian, he kind of, takes certain taxation rates and factors in, what the rates of taxation are versus the revenue collected. And he comes up with this figure that, on average, an Indian earns about £2 a year, which is devastating from the standpoint of the British argument that, Britain has made India more wealthy and more prosperous because, in comparison to India, the average Briton is making £33, right? So, an average Briton is 15 times more wealthy than an Indian. And Naoroji would take that statistic of, £2 per head and contrast it with the idea of what you could do with £2. And the answer to that question was you couldn't do much. In fact, he showed through statistics that with £2 a year, you could barely keep yourself alive. More money was spent by the British government to imprison an Indian and keep that Indian, in good health with food and proper clothing than the average Indian could get through, £2. Okay, so, it's through a series of comparative analyses, Naoroji establishes that the reason why India is on the cusp of famine all the time is because with £2, you are always living on the edge of starvation. Okay, and if something like a delay in the monsoon happens and a famine occurs, you're dead. Okay, so we see a particular trajectory in his economic thought that eventually veers much more towards the political economic, in the sense that from his early writings, he's talking about the drain theory. The idea that British rule was, impoverishing India. He eventually comes up with the idea that a bulk of this impoverishment is taking place directly by British officers. The fact that Indians are paying for these British officers, paying their salaries, and these salaries are eventually going back to Great Britain. That was a huge drain on the exchequer. So he comes up with political ideas. Instead of Britons running the country, let's have Indians. This idea of simultaneous examinations, that Indians could take exams to join the civil service in India. Previously, they had to go to London, which was, of course, a huge expense for them. And if we get more Indians in the civil service through simultaneous examinations, we therefore can have more Indians who are more cost efficient, who are more inclined to develop policies which are more in keeping with Indian demands and Indian desires. You can have the civil service eventually Indianized. And from once you get to that idea that the civil service could progressively become more Indian, it's only a few leaps to come to the idea of self-government. I mean, what if instead of the civil service being, say, 75% Indian, you could have 100% Indian? And Naoroji comes to this idea by 1884, which is insanely early from the standpoint of Indian nationalism. The idea of some sort of self-government at this early stage. It was built, this idea of Swaraj and self-government was built intrinsically on the study of poverty. Because again, the reason why the full Indianization of the civil service is justified is because it was a way to stop the drain of wealth. So while Naoroji is talking about these political and economic ideas with regard to India, he's also engaging with ideas more broadly discussed throughout Europe and other parts of the world, like America and even places like Japan and such. He uses a lot of the ideas of John Stuart Mill to discuss ideas of capitalism with regard to India. So when he talks about the need for capital in India, he refers to Mill's principles of political economy. To essentially make the point that since India is being drained of capital, it's like a cyclical process of India continuously getting poorer. At the same time, he might have had a hand in influencing the ideas of Karl Marx. We do not know whether Marx and Naoroji actually met one another. They certainly lived next to one, relatively close by to one another in London in the 70s and the 60s of the 19th century. But they had a common friend, Henry Hinman, who was a socialist leader. And that common friend certainly put Marx, in touch with some of Naoroji's writings towards the very end of his life. And we know that Marx wrote one letter to a Russian Narodnik economist, Nikolai Danielson, which talked about a drain of wealth. And it's probably no coincidence that this letter was written not too far after Hinman had written to Marx talking about Naoroji's economic work. So you see indirect influence, perhaps at the most cautious level, perhaps direct influence if you want to be a little more reckless in making conclusions, but some linking of the ideas of one of the world's greatest economic thinkers of the 19th century with one of India's greatest economic thinkers of that period as well. So with regard to poverty and study of it in relation to political ideas, I want to talk a little bit about how it affected things on the ground closer to your place of residence and study in Gujarat. Naoroji had tremendous links throughout his life with the princely states of Gujarat. So his family came from Navsari, which again was in Baroda, and his parents and grandparents farmed in Dharampur, which was another princely state close by to Navsari. And throughout his life, he had very strong links with several states, in particular in Gujarat. And I've just named a few of them over here. So in Baroda, we'll talk about quite a bit. But even smaller states in Saurashtra, like Gondal and Bhavnagar, Jamnagar, or Nawanagar, he had strong ties. And then in Kutch, he had family ties which extended all the way actually up until the 1970s. There were Naoroji family members living there all the way until I think actually 1980 when the last one passed away. So what explains these links with Gujarati princely states? Well, the reason is that one component of Naoroji's idea of the drain of wealth was that princely India might actually be more prosperous than British India. It did not have the same drain of wealth that British India had because it was governed by Indians. And you see that Naoroji develops a whole other set of calculations to kind of try to make this point. And this idea is integrated with a large facet of early Indian nationalism. Could the princes be yoked to the cause of Indian nationalism? Could they actually help put forth the idea that Indians were fit and able to rule themselves? So I think Manu Pillai's latest book, which I haven't got a chance to read as yet, talks a lot about this dynamic with regard to states like Baroda and Mysore and Travancore, about how, again, a lot of these early nationalists looked to princely states to be places that could act as political laboratories. And Naoroji was one of them because, in 1873, he's appointed by Mallarao Gaikwad, the ruler of Baroda, to be Diwan. And during this, very brief diwanship, which lasts for a little over a year, Naoroji brings a lot of the products of Elphinstone College, a lot of these very educated, Western-oriented individuals to wholesale transform the administration of Baroda state, to make it more modern. So he brings in people like Qazi Shahabuddin, who's a very kind of like reform-minded intellectual from Bombay. He brings in people like Bal Mangesh Bagle to kind of who again, comes from this kind of, liberal circle coming out of Elphinstone, and they do their bit to kind of transform and modernize the administration. They do stuff like, lower land assessment rates, which hadn't been lowered since the time of the American Civil War, when, everyone was getting very rich. But they run into a lot of problems also, which again express the limitations of just how far you could go with princely states. Because Malharao Gaikwad was, by all accounts, not the most stable of rulers, to say the least, and he was engaged in a absolutely fierce war with the British resident for political control, and Naoroji was caught up in this. He took part in these yards that were written to the British government asking for the resident Robert Fair to be removed, and Fair was also equally crazy in his own ways. He was a very kind of messianic Christian who had it out for Indians in many ways. So he was Naoroji was literally stuck between a rock and a hard place at this time, and he finally tenders his resignation in late 1874, which is actually at a good time, because just shortly after that, Malharao is removed by the British government because the British government feels that he's had a hand in actually poisoning Fair, which was a huge scandal in that era. And Naoroji takes part in kind of, working with the British authorities to see what exactly had happened. And eventually, this Maharaja is deposed, and a young boy comes on the throne, who of course is Saiji Rao Gaikwad. So this whole episode was quite disillusioning to Naoroji. It ends in shambles. I mean, they did a part in modernizing the infrastructure of the state, but ultimately, it comes to a humiliating end. But I think what is significant is that Naoroji does not give up on his ties with princely states. He continues to correspond with princely rulers throughout his life. He's writing to rulers of small states. So here's a letter from the ruler of Dharampur around the time that Naoroji is elected to parliament. And he's, the ruler is asking, can you bring up my affairs in parliament once you're in it? But he's also talking with rulers of fairly larger states, like Kingarji, who's the Maharao of Kutch. And Kingarji's father, Pragmalji, had actually worked with Naoroji to kind of diffuse a big conflict in the 1860s. And Kingarji returned the favor to Naoroji because Naoroji's family, through his son, lived in Kutch. And when his son passed away suddenly in 1892, Kingarji gives royal support to Naoroji's descendants there, and enables a lot of Naoroji's grandchildren to have an education. He kind of steps in as almost a quasi-fatherly figure after Naoroji's son passes away and leaves 8 children without a father figure. And of course, the links with other rulers, people like Bhagwat Singhji, who I'll talk about a little bit later. But you see kind of this very symbiotic relationship developing between princely rulers and people like Naoroji in the nationalist movement. These princely rulers provide money and assistance to early nationalists, and these early nationalists do the political bidding of these rulers in London. They lobby on their behalf. So Bhagwat Singhji, for example, got caught up in a paternity suit. He might have had an illegitimate child in London. And so people like Naoroji and Bairamji Malbari, who was also a close aide of Naoroji, kind of help Bhagwat Singhji in his legal problems. So again, a kind of symbiotic relationship is developed, which gives us an opportunity to talk about where Naoroji's career goes after he moves into politics in London. So as I mentioned, from 1855 onward, Naoroji really had one foot in Great Britain. From 1855 through really, 1907, Naoroji spends a good chunk of his time in Britain while going back to India for several years at small stretches. Okay, he has his family there. He's also operating a business. He has, of course, political ties there. But by the 1880s, he really puts down roots in Great Britain, specifically in 1885, 1886, right after the first Indian National Congress in December 1885, because he decides to stand for the British Parliament. And the reason why he decides to stand is, again, he's developed this idea of the drain of wealth and the need to Indianize the civil service, and he thinks the best way to do it was actually through Parliament. You could not ask reform to the white the white Maharajas or Sahib sitting in Calcutta or Shimla, because they were just too reactionary. So you had a better chance in London, where you had many MPs who were actually quite sympathetic to India's political concerns. So he, by and large, joins the Liberal Party. He joins a lot of the organs of the Liberal Party, like the National Liberal Club, and he attempts to stand for election. And he does this in quite a unique way. So, I mean, he's influenced by Liberal Party circuits, but he's also influenced by many other political streams of thought in late Victorian India. Late Victorian Great Britain, and one of the the most controversial and important streams is, of course, Irish nationalism. And Naoroji very presciently develops links with Irish nationalists who are arguing for home rule, kind of similar to what Indians would eventually call for in terms of self-government or home rule. Once Annie Besant and Tilak come to the stage is what Indians adopt as a goal also. And these links could actually be quite strong, to the sense that some Irish actually see some utility in using the commonalities between Ireland and India's political demands, and actually suggest that Naoroji stand for election to the British Parliament from an Irish seat. So, talk about head-spinning global connections. On at least 3 occasions, Naoroji could have been elected. I mean, this ultimately doesn't pan out due to local political problems, but on 3 separate occasions, the Irish political leadership considers having Naoroji stand for an Irish political seat as an Irish MP, but also someone who would reflect India's concerns. Now, the other great stream of thought which influences Naoroji is, of course, socialism. Socialism is something which, of course, really shines its light on Indian nationalism post-World War I, but it gets an early start with Naoroji. And through Naoroji, you get a generation of people also by the early 20th century who are influenced with a lot of socialist ideas. And here again, Henry Hinman, the man who puts Naoroji's ideas in touch with Marx, plays a critical role. Hinman formed the first socialist party in Great Britain, the Social Democratic Federation, and Naoroji was, by all means, pretty much a proxy member of this organization. He gave talks to this organization. The SDF in turn supported his parliamentary campaigns. He also reaches out to women. So another political stream that he immerses himself in is that of women's suffrage and feminism. So he develops close ties with a lot of the leading feminists of this era, and people like Josephine Butler, for example, and gets their moral support in turn for political reform in India. So again, kind of this reciprocal relationship, as you see with the princely states, between members of constituencies which you wouldn't imagine being interested in Indian nationalism. And again, these links went so deep that on occasion, Naoroji would share the stage with people like Rukmabai, the famous Indian woman who kind of refused to cohabit with her husband and took it to court, and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the American suffragist. So Naoroji was really plugged into international connections, not just for things like socialism, but also things like feminism. He actually goes and attends conferences put on by his feminist friends in places like Switzerland, Geneva, in the 1890s. So all of this adds up to kind of a grand strategy on Naoroji's part. I mean, he's trying to get Britons interested in India, because that's kind of the best way that he can kind of relate to British voters. Vote for me because I have something to tell you about your biggest colonial possession. It's not being run very well, and here's why. But he also, through these networks with socialists or feminists or what have you, Irish, he's able to develop strong links with domestic political considerations in Great Britain as well, which transform him into, again, someone who is a supporter of workers' rights, or someone who is a supporter of Irish home rule. And that made him more appealing as a potential MP for people sitting in a constituency in Great Britain. Now, of course, being elected as an Indian for Parliament in this era was a very uphill challenge. Naoroji stood once in 1886 and lost in Holborn. In 1888, he stands again as a Liberal candidate in central Finsbury, which is kind of the area to the northeast of St. Pancras in London, quite a nice area today, with a long, very long socialist kind of leftist tradition, which helped Naoroji. But even in this quite leftist bastion, where there was a large Irish population which was sympathetic to Naoroji encountered a great deal of racism. Now, that racism was balanced out to a degree by anti-racism. I mean, there were strong anti-racist links in the Victorian era as well. But by 1888, 1889, it got to the point where even the Prime Minister of Britain, Lord Salisbury, was using racist language to kind of put down Naoroji and his parliamentary campaigns. Salisbury very famously referred to Naoroji as a black man who wouldn't get elected. And that black man reference was meant in obviously a very derogatory way. This actually helped Naoroji because, even by the standards of Victorian era bigotry, this was a step too far. And so Salisbury indirectly, and Salisbury had a reputation for putting his proverbial foot in his mouth, Salisbury, kind of helped cultivate sympathy for Naoroji. And you see that this anti-racist network, these anti-racist networks of the Victorian era consequently come to help Naoroji in his parliamentary campaign. At the same time, again, looking transnationally, those princely state links that we talked about earlier came to Naoroji's rescue. If you were an Indian standing for parliament, you needed money. And if you got money from India, that wasn't good enough because a lot of that, the value of that money was shaved off due to the exchange rate of the time. So you needed even more money. And the best place to get the money was from princes. So you see in Naoroji's correspondence, a lot of these very cryptic letters being sent by Naoroji's aides and supporters in India, basically giving him instructions about how to ask for very large wads of money from princes. So here's one such letter that's sent from Bairamji Malbari to Naoroji. Malbari would refer to Naoroji as dad. So, when I looked at letters in the archives, I was wondering who is this person being referred to as dad, and eventually I realized it's Naoroji. But he says things like, talk to K and the T will give you 50 more. And as you see on the slide, that basically means talk to the personal secretary of Bhagwat Singhji, the Thakur of Gondal, and he will give you 25 or 50,000 more rupees. And people like Bhagwat Singhji or Saiji Rao and others gave fantastic sums to Naoroji, which eventually enabled Naoroji to build up a campaign machinery which allowed him to win. He won by only 5 votes, right? After which he's dubbed Dadabhai Naoroji, Dadabhai narrow majority. But again, all these international links that I've talked about come to his rescue. I mean, women help canvass for his election. They can't vote, but they help knock on the doors of men and talk to men and tell them why you should vote for Naoroji. Irish men come out in support. Workers come out in support. And of course, those princely individuals are providing money, and the few Indians who are resident in London are campaigning for it. So you actually do see, a few individuals who eventually would go on to play quite a big role in Indian politics. People like Joseph Baptista, potentially Jinnah, though that's a little unclear because Jinnah had a habit of exaggerating, actually take part and campaign for Naoroji on the ground in London. So it's quite a fascinating episode. So Naoroji is elected as the MP from Central Finsbury, and also thereafter as the MP for India. And this is a huge moment in early Indian nationalism. When Naoroji comes back for the first time to India, supposedly half of Bombay comes out to greet him. 500,000 people. The population of Bombay was 1 million, which is of course hard to believe because I'm sure there are only 1 million people within a mile of where I'm sitting in Bombay. But this is a huge moment in Indian nationalism and within the history of the Indian National Congress. It really puts the Congress on the world stage. And it also puts on the world stage many of Naoroji's demands, specifically for, again, simultaneous examination and the Indianization of the civil service. He helps put together a resolution in support of simultaneous examination, which is passed by the British Parliament through rather devious mechanisms, which eventually kind of piss off a lot of liberal, colleagues of Naoroji, but it passes. But ultimately, what Naoroji learns the hard way is that, you can garner as much support as you can amongst Irishmen and women and certain progressive parliamentarians in Parliament, but ultimately the large bulk of Britons, both inside and outside of Parliament, still will mostly ignore you. They're not interested in Indian affairs, right? It's not their constituency. It's a colonial subject thousands of miles away. Yes, their wealth is dependent upon India, but there's not much interest, right? So Naoroji's tone in Parliament becomes much more shrill and radical. As the years 1893, 1894, 1895 progress on, to the point where he's actually in responses to the Queen's speech, which was meant to be kind of a show of loyalty, he's actually comparing Indians to slaves in the South, in America. He's talking about Indians as the poorest people in the world. So this in turn kind of alienates Naoroji from a lot of moderates or conservatives. And finally, in 1895, he loses election. Re-election to parliament. And this in many ways is kind of the lowest point in his career. And it brings us to the final phase of his career. And I'll spend the few minutes just the last few minutes of my presentation just talking about this last moment. Naoroji is 70 years old at this point, and most sensible people would have probably retired, gone back to Bombay if they were living in a place like London and they had roots in Bombay. Naoroji doubles down and kind of accelerates his political activities, and he turns far more to the left. He reaches out to socialist allies, to Irish political friends, and he starts mass agitation for calling out the British government for its handling of things like the plague epidemic, which of course we've heard a lot about in the past few years, or mass famine in India, which was again rearing its ugly head in the Bombay presidency and parts of North India from 1896 onward. He develops more international friendships. So from at least the late 1870s, Naoroji is starting to talk to people in America because he recognizes America as kind of this rising power, and he sees lots of comparisons between, economic development as it should go in a place like America and economic development as it should not go in a place like India. He sees lots of points of comparisons and talks to a lot of industrialists and government figures consequently in America, and he reaches out to anti-imperialists in America and compares the growth of an American empire with what Britain has done to India. And this in turn interests a lot of American anti-imperialists. Even a person as prominent as William Jennings Bryan, who was presidential candidate in 1890, in the election of 1900, someone who was an anti-imperialist and actually saw commonality between, say, what Britain was doing in India and what Americans were threatening to do in the Philippines, which America had recently annexed, and came to this conclusion that ultimately imperialism was not just damaging for the people who were being colonized, but also for the colonizers themselves. So Naoroji's ideas, again, he's talking about things like a drain of wealth and all the different terrible political repercussions that a drain of wealth causes are being translated into different imperial contexts, like those of the Americans. And he's also reaching out to other Americans who are, obviously not part of this imperial project, but are being affected by different forms of what we can call a form of colonialism. I mean, in terms of, what African Americans had to deal with, not just before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, being second-class citizens, being reduced to levels of economic penury. So from the 1890s onward, Naoroji is starting to take a greater interest in the state of African Americans. He meets visiting African Americans to London, people like I.W. Wells, who was a founder of the NAACP, and some of his writings are read by people like W.B. Du Bois, the famous African American thinker and activist, who of course goes on to eventually influence Martin Luther King. So we see again a very broad arc of political ideas, influencing one another over here. And Naoroji's involvements in activities of a global African diaspora, grow through this African American link. He takes an indirect part in the first Pan-African conference, which was put on by a group of West Indian migrants to London. Very strategically, these people had their office, these West Indian migrants had their office in a building called Palace Chambers, which was right next door to where the Indian National Congress had its office in London. So we can only imagine the state of communication between these two neighbors. And we know that Naoroji at least made financial donations to this organization, and who knows what other links were being forged between these two groups. So African Americans, Americans, the other big group that takes a prominent role in Naoroji's more global understandings of politics at this stage are socialists. Naoroji attends the Amsterdam Socialist Congress in 1906, along with people like Hinman, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, other very prominent European leaders. Are part of this event and brings issues of Indian colonialism to this body. Now, at the same time, other global links are being forged with Indians, people like Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi first corresponds with Naoroji around 1893 or 1894 or so, and Gandhi asked for Naoroji's political support when he was just starting his career in Durban. And this starts again about maybe about 15 years of correspondence with Naoroji and Gandhi. Nowhere near as close and influential as, say, Gandhi's correspondence and work with someone like Gokhale, but still significant in its own way. Gandhi in turn gets quite influenced by a lot of Naoroji's ideas and methods and tactics, at least in the early phase of his career. Now, of course, this is all taking place upon the backdrop of changes within the Congress party, right? And in the sense that, after, say, 1904, 1905, the Congress is increasingly splitting into moderate and radical factions. And Naoroji, who had always been seen as kind of the vanguard of a more radical element of the Congress, is now increasingly falling between two extremes. The radicals are seeing him as too moderate, the moderates are seeing him as too radicals. So much so that when the Congress takes place in 1906 in Calcutta, Naoroji is picked as kind of a compromise candidate between moderates and radicals. He's the only person who's kind of appealing to both, the group that Tilak is leading and the group that people like Gokhale and Firoz Shah Mehta are leading. And this forms one element of really what is Naoroji's most active political year, 1906, when he's 80. Okay, so, someone who is now an octogenarian is not slowing down. He does a series of pretty incredible things in his 80th year. First of all, he writes letters to the British Prime Minister, Henry Campbell Bannerman, demanding self-government for India. He talks about self-government being under something called British paramountcy, which is something I'll get to in just a second. He also campaigns once more for Parliament. He loses, but he keeps up these demands for some sort of big reform on the part of the British. So he actually categorizes Swaraj as a form of reparation that Great Britain can give to India. He actually sets out in one of these letters to Campbell Bannerman kind of about a 20-year plan of what Britain would do to give India a measure of self-government. He also talks with Gandhi, meets Gandhi in London when Gandhi comes to London in 1906 to campaign for political rights of South African Indians. And of course, he goes back to India in late 1906 to take part in the Calcutta Congress. And again, as I said, Naoroji fell between these two ends of the political spectrum in the Congress, and his speech really helped determine the future course of the Congress, in the sense that the speech that he gave, was far too radical for the moderates, and in many ways satisfied many of the demands of the radicals. He called for Swaraj. Previously, he had talked about, again, Swaraj under British paramountcy. Now he just called for Swaraj, plain and simple. So he has this deliberately vague phrase where he says India needed self-government or Swaraj like in the United Kingdom or like in the colonies. Now, by the colonies, he meant something like Australia or Canada, where you're under British rule, but like the United Kingdom, you're a free and autonomous unit, right? I mean, you're a notch above the colonies. This was a deliberately vaguely worded declaration of what Swaraj would be like. And importantly, Naoroji looks around the world to justify his demands. He looks at political change that's taking place in places like China or Japan, as well as places like Russia or Iran, where constitutional revolutions had just taken place in 1905. So, this last political declaration that he gives in 1906 really kind of in many ways hands the torch to the radicals. I mean, there are ways that the radicals are disappointed with Naoroji's speech. I can get to that in question and answers, but it gives a fill-up to people like Tilak. And we know that people like Gokhale and Mehta were a bit disheartened by what Naoroji was doing. So in this kind of last political activity that Naoroji does, he gives impetus to a more radical stream of thought in Indian nationalism, and at the same time, does something that is noticed by people around the world. So Du Bois, who had been following Naoroji for some years now, once he reads Naoroji's speech, he publishes a very short commentary in one of his magazines that he publishes out of the United States. And he says, the dark world has awakened to life and speech, courage, comrades. And that is the way that he described Naoroji's declaration of Swaraj. So we see, again, Swaraj being interpreted in very different ways internationally, right? I mean, the Irish are talking about it in some way. Feminists in Great Britain are relating to Indian political demands in another. Indians, of course, are expressing it in another way. But even someone like an African-American intellectual can take heart from Naoroji's political work tens of thousands of miles away in a distant continent. So with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you for listening. I know I've gone a little bit over time. I'd be happy to take any questions. And if you have any more interest in Naoroji, I have some material on the website that I've listed over here.
Thank you so much. I think that was a fascinating, capturing and encompassing such a vast and like a, transnational life, like you have mentioned in your book and in your abstract. So I think there are possibilities of a lot of curiosities probably, and I'm sure there will be questions also. And that's, I think what we can do is, since this is a closed room, what we can do is we can just open up and if Sham, can you just allow people to speak, unmute themselves, or if you can just raise your hand, then I can unmute you, and then probably we can go around collecting some questions.
Thank you. My name is Farid Alatas. I'm from National University of Singapore. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel. I enjoyed the talk very much.
Thank you.
I first came across Naoroji when I read this Introduction to Development Theory by Bjorn Hettner in the 1980s. One of the very, very few, you must know the work, of course, one of the very few works on development studies which makes reference to Naoroji, and well, he says that he was something of a precursor to dependency theory. But I was interested in, I know that you've written about Naoroji and his correspondence or his contact with Orientalists working on Parsis. So my question is this. To what extent do you feel that Naoroji was aware of the problems of Orientalism, seeing that he was critical of of British rule and so on and so forth, and he was active in terms of on the political stage, but in terms of knowledge production, what were his thoughts, and what kinds of interventions did he make? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So thanks for that reference also. I actually did not know of that reference, so that's something good for me to know. In terms of Naoroji's relationship with Orientalism, yeah, I mean, for the most part, he was one of those individuals who was attacking notions of, a quote unquote Oriental inferiority, so to speak, right? In the sense that, he actually engaged in a very dramatic showdown, if you will, with one particular individual in London who had delivered a paper that was littered with all these kind of social Darwinist ideas of what the differences were between Europeans and what he termed Asiatics. And Naoroji, right after this individual had given this presentation of the next meeting of I think it was the Royal Society of Ethnography in London, literally takes apart this person's talk and says, well, you talk about quote unquote Orientals being lazy and Asians not being innovative. Well, what about all the crime that you see on the streets here in London? What about the lack of morals? What about the fact that colonialism is this whole system where you're deliberately putting down other people? At the same time, he also, addresses the issue of race. Why are, differentials being, drawn between, say, people who are Iranian or Indian or Japanese or whatever. He goes back in history and says, well, look, prior to, the rise of European empires, most of, the locus of, economic growth and, cultural production would have been a place like China or India or Iran. So in that sense, he is, pushing back against those tropes of social Darwinism and European superiority. At the same time, I don't want to give the impression that, he was someone who, like us today, would talk about some a completely colorblind environment, because he did subscribe himself to some ideas of civilizational hierarchy, in the sense that if he wanted to talk about India's demands for political better political environment, he would say we are not Hottentots, right, which is a direct reference to saying we are not like Africans. We have more civilization. So, we cannot excuse those references. I will qualify them by saying that in comparison with 99.9% of other political figures, Naoroji was not making those really egregious racial statements. I mean, someone like Hinman, who was very progressive in all other streams, was also a raging anti-Semitic, right? I mean, if you read Naoroji, Hinman's letters to Naoroji, they are referenced all throughout with the Jews are like this and whatever, and he gets similar things from American anti-imperialists, and Naoroji does not, in his responses, does not respond. He doesn't take that bait, or at least he doesn't really pick up on those ideas. He also hits out against Britons for their attitudes towards the Irish. He was very conscious of British racism towards Irish people, and he defends Irish people to a very great degree. And he says, how can you Britons treat them as badly as you've done over these past few centuries? So the answer is complex. He's more progressive than most other people, but he's still a Victorian, and he's still subject to many of those prejudices that anyone would have been subjected to.
Right.
Can I quickly just ask very quickly? You mentioned lazy. Was there actually any discussion about laziness, the accusation of lazy natives?
So this particular, this particular response that Naoroji gives in 1866, it's a paper he gives called "The Rights of Man," and what am I talking about? The European and Asiatic races. It's in response to a paper that was done, just a week or so beforehand, and this British Orientalist had said, things like, the natural tendency of a Briton or a European was to stand, whereas the natural tendency of an Asian was to squat. And again, a lot of these ideas that were common at the time, the Asian was nowhere near as industrious because of the weather and because of what have you. So yes, a lot of these attitudes are being bandied around in Naoroji's circle, and Naoroji tries to swat them down one by one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful question and for the response also. So we have a question from Patrick, and he's asking that, can you explain how far Naoroji's comparative acceptance and success in a British and imperial context may have been connected with his Parsi heritage?
It's a very good question. And I think that there were definitely many ways that Naoroji did something that other Indians would have a very difficult time doing. For that reason, the next book I'm working on, I'm having a chapter on Lal Mohan Bush, who was a Bengali and was also the first Indian to stand for the British Parliament in 1885. And what you see with Ghosh, and Ghosh is again, he's Bengali, he's much darker skinned than Naoroji. He speaks very good English. He's probably as good of an English speaker as Naoroji, but he faces much more racism, much more of a backlash, because of those British stereotypes specifically towards Bengali. For various reasons, a lot of elite Britons had much more favorable views towards Parsis. Many of those reasons were racial, because Parsis were lighter skinned. Many of those other views were due to the fact that Parsis had, of course, an unfair advantage economically and therefore were richer in a colonial environment. But it's telling to compare someone like Ghosh with Naoroji, because again, Ghosh is being again caricatured as a Bengali Babu throughout the British press. Naoroji, when Salisbury calls him a black man, oftentimes the most common defense against Naoroji is, no, actually look at him, he's rather light-skinned, which of course in our context is ridiculous, right? That's not the point that we should really be talking about, but that was considered important, right? That this man can pass off as an Englishman because he's relatively light-skinned, he speaks good English, and his manners are relatively Anglophile. So yes, to a large degree, I think being a Parsi helped. And it also helped that since he was in a community that already was very rich and had a lot of ties in Great Britain, he had a lot of friends, who could help him in his activities. So, Bairamji Malbari is a very good example. Malbari is a fascinating guy because he didn't actually go to Great Britain until 1890 or so, but he was already in touch with people like Tennyson and, other major political figures, John Bright and such. And he knew British politics probably as well as most British political commentators, in spite of being, again, 10,000 miles away. And through people like Malbari, the world of liberal politics, the world of, Victorian culture is open to Naoroji. And, the same is true for the ties that someone like, say, a Jamshedji Tata or, other prominent Parsis of this era could bring to Naoroji. So yeah, it does unfortunately, and I say unfortunately deliberately here, it helped Naoroji in ways that would have been probably impossible for, say, a Bengali or a member of another group in India to really take advantage from.
I have a follow-up question with relation to that question, that there was an interesting caricature that you showed in the presentation, in which when Naoroji is demanding for Swaraj, he is depicted, there's a Hinduized kind of a caricature. And I was just wondering that, because he is Parsi, but he is shown to be depicted as a Hindu. Was there this idea that Swaraj then is something that the Hindus Swaraj, or the Hindus, self-rule for the Hindus, or was that at that time the conception of religion blending into the idea of self-rule? Because my question is basically to ask that, was what Savarkar later on writes about Hindutva and about, who should be ruling, right? The self-rule should be for whom? I was just wondering that, was there a precursor or was there that kind of an idea that if he's asking for Swaraj, he maybe is thinking from the Hindu line of thought or something of that sort? I wanted to understand why was that caricature, at that point in time. It was intriguing.
So that's a very interesting image in the sense that it was done by a Parsi artist, published in Bombay and eventually republished in London. And as you mentioned, the depiction over there is of Naoroji with, there's swastiks. He's, I think, there's some other Hindu imagery, and that's one of several images that show something similar. In another image, Naoroji is holding a trishul. In another image, Naoroji is like a sadhu. And I think that says more about, again, how, unlike today, there was this kind of religious blending, not necessarily, Hindu dominated. I mean, this was a particular trope that particular artist was going for. But I don't know myself, but I would not be surprised to see Naoroji potentially being, drawn in, say, something more familiar something with more Muslim political imagery as well. Because in this era, it was possible to, kind of straddle those boundaries. And, it also says a little bit about how Parsis are culturated within India. I mean, still today, we use swastiks sometimes in our religious, if we do, some decorations for religious festivals and such like that. We've borrowed a lot of stuff from Hindu iconography and religious symbolism. And at least in this era, it wasn't that much of a problem. It's, again, to show you how much has changed between then and unfortunately now, when Britons start attacking Naoroji as being an unfit person to be a member of parliament, one of the tactics they use is they say he's a Parsi. He's not a Hindu, he's not a Muslim, and therefore he's not representative. And by and large, most Indians say nothing doing, right? I mean, this is not, we don't care. He's an Indian. Now, of course, things are different.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. We have 3 questions now. So, Tana, you can go first, and then Aprajit, and then Amol. You can just unmute yourself and ask.
Hi. Should I go?
Yes, Tana.
Yeah. Hi, Dinyar. We had met at that IIM conference. How are you?
Good to see you again. Thank you.
Good to see you. Yeah. No, so I was just, I was, since this is about Dadabhai Naoroji, there's a very interesting story about him sending the first machine for the textile mills in Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
And we very, very often narrate that incident where Ranchhodlal Chotalal had ordered the first machine from Dadabhai Naoroji. Do you have more information? What are the kind of evidences that we have? Because when I bring this up in my business history class, it's very interesting, and it was shipped. I think it was shipped from London, and then the first consignment sunk, and then the second consignment came, and I think it landed in Cambay, and from there it was brought in bullock carts to Ahmedabad, right? Do we have more evidences to kind of support this this story?
It's a fascinating story. What I know, at least, is that, again, a lot of the sources from this are long gone, right? So I mean, the stories that we're hearing are via indirect sources or hearsay and such. But as far as I could tell with the story, what you were talking about is roughly correct in the sense that, so Naoroji was working in London. He operated a business that was dealing in cotton machinery and also cotton exports and imports, going from India to Great Britain. And so when Ranchod Lal wanted to get a machine for use in this mills, he contacted Naoroji, but that particular consignment sunk. Now it sunk somewhere off South Africa. I don't know about the second machine. I don't know if he got it from Naoroji or not, or if he got it from another particular source. But certainly, what you talk about, going to Kambat and being taken by bullock cart, that probably makes the most sense. I mean, I haven't seen that part of the story, but I don't see any other way they could get it, say, up the Sabarmati or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of for all the textile history that follows. I mean, that was the first time that we are setting up the textile mills in late 19th century. I mean, it was radical for that time. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that really kind of set the mills going for Ahmedabad.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing with the Naoroji papers, and again a lot of the other sources that we have, as you know, right, for Gujarat, is that we've done such a great job of destroying them that we don't know what actually happened, right? So with Naoroji's papers, most of the papers before 1886 are gone because of humidity, white ants, your usual stuff, incompetence of the people who are dealing with them. And our friends at Gujarat State Archives have also done a very good, effective job of destroying material when I discovered when I went to Baroda and such. So we don't know, unfortunately. If you find anything about this, please let me know. I'd be interested. I mean, I wonder if, a Gujarati paper.
I will. Thank you so much, Dunya.
Sure. Okay.
Right. We have Aprajit. Can you ask your question? Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dinya, for a really fascinating presentation. I'm sorry I'm not in a position to switch on my video, but
no problem.
I want to continue on this theme of industry because I recall, I think in an earlier talk you had spoken a little bit more about the fact that Naoroji was representing some business interests when he first went to London, right? I mean, you later spoke about the money he gets as donation from princely rulers and so on. But obviously, the big question one would get is what was he doing for a living, and what was his mode of sustenance to be living in London for so long, and so on. So, to what extent did his business connections and so on influence his political views? And the second part of that question is there any evidence of correspondence or direct influence on Ranade, because Ranade is the other person who talks a lot about industry and so on, and I'm kind of interested in knowing whether there's a direct link in their ideas development.
Unfortunately, thank you for those questions. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, if I were to summarize my question and my answer in 3 words, we don't know. Again, a lot of the sources are gone. So I mean, dealing with your first question about what he was doing, what were his business activities. So as I mentioned, he had this company. Prior to that, he worked for the Kama family, which was a enterprising Parsi family, which was first involved in opium and then went on to cotton. And so he went with some Kama siblings and relatives to set up a company in Liverpool and London that dealt in the cotton trade. There was some falling out. Again, we don't know precisely. There are various stories about what the falling out is about, but it's impossible to verify because those papers are gone. So by the 1860s, he has his own company, Dadabhai, Naoroji and Company. We have some documents from that company, but by and large, the really interesting, important stuff is gone. So where I found information about the company was, again, through a little bit of material in the Naoroji papers, and then through something called Chancery Court records. So just as Indians love to sue one another today, and which is why we have this, wonderful, court system with, century-long cases and whatever, Indians were very fond of suing people back then in that era also. And so I can tell a lot about Naoroji's commercial activities because he was involved in various lawsuits in London. With various companies, both Indian and British, run out of London or Liverpool or whatever, and so that gives us a general clue of who he's dealing with. At the same time, I can tell that by the 1860s or so, Naoroji is relatively rich, because when many of his friends lose money in the cotton, after the end of the American Civil War, when there's the share crisis and stuff like that, Naoroji gives them loans. And unfortunately, many of them can't pay him back. So there's this whole train of like angry letters that Naoroji continues to write through the 70s. You haven't paid me back. Where's my money? So we can tell little bits here and there of his activities, but by and large, the really interesting stuff about what his company was doing, I was unable to find much. I mean, again, there might be some stuff somewhere in London. I mean, maybe at the London Metropolitan Archives or something. I was unable to get there. I'd love to know more. With regard to Ranade and Naoroji, again, the big stumbling block we hit upon is that Ranade's papers are by and large lost. So, the Ranade papers that we have in the National Archives of India is hardly anything, right? I mean, there is correspondence between the two men, and surely they were in touch with one another. And surely Naoroji knew what was going on with the Pune Sarvjanik Sabha and such, and Naoroji's and Ranade's writing. To the degree of what precisely was being discussed by the two men, I unfortunately can't say much, because again, that material disappeared 70, 80, 90 years ago. It's really unfortunate, how much is missing from this era.
Because Naoroji would have been slightly older, I think, about 2 decades or so.
Right. He would have been older. I mean, again, he came from, there's so many parallels, right? I mean, both went to Elphinstone. When Naoroji is appointed Diwan of Baroda, one of the people he wants to have come and work for him in Baroda is Ranade. And Ranade says, unfortunately, I can't come. I've been just appointed as a judge. So there's so many places where the careers crisscross over one another. And of course, Gokhale was another common link. There must have been a fascinating relationship, but as is the case for us who study Indian history, as you know, we're condemned to not know due to the deterioration of archival materials.
Yeah, I know, what a pity. But thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prajit. Now, so we have a question from Amol and then Murari, and then we have Muskan, a student. So Amol, you can proceed. Amol is
hi
economics faculty. Yes.
Hi, Danyar. We again met at the IMA conference. So wonderful to hear you. I've obviously been hearing a lot of stuff, and I think your SPJ and webinars are pretty interesting. So I've been sort of catching up with them too.
Oh, thank you.
So I mean, I just had a quick comments and some questions. So one is this: that when you mentioned about the princely, that Naoroji kind of borrowing money from these or the sending princely state guys. Any ideas about the channels of finance? How is it working? I mean, how are they sending funds from India to there? What are the kind of, so being a finance sort of a person, I'm kind of interested in this. Second is that you mentioned about Naoroji's, Stuart Mill and possibility that he met Marx or did not meet Marx. I kind of missed. I was under the impression that this talk is at 6, but somehow I missed some 15-20 minutes of it. So I don't know whether you covered all that. So any other economic historians who were of influence to Naoroji, anything which apart from Marx and Mill, if you could help me with. And obviously your reference to Malhar Rao brought me to this history of Bank of Baroda, where Sayaji Rao comes in after the excesses of Malhar Rao, and he forms the Bank of Baroda. So that was just some kind of a comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. Yes, and it's good to see you. Good to see a lot of familiar faces here. So yeah, I mean, the Bank of Baroda thing is interesting because I remember about 10 years ago, Bank of Baroda had an ad campaign where they said, banker to this Indian, and one of them featured Naoroji's face. So presumably he had a Bank of Baroda account. So yeah, I talked a little bit about Naoroji's, most likely indirect ties with Marx, in the sense that Henry Hinman, who was a common friend, probably transmitted a lot of Naoroji's ideas of the drain to Marx toward the end of his life. Finding other thinkers who influenced Naoroji or were influenced by him, it was difficult. So, there's one American scholar who talked about how he was in touch with Friedrich List, and that List had a correspondence with Naoroji. That's not the case. There is no correspondence. I checked up and down in the Naoroji papers, and that's, and I actually asked the scholar, and she said, essentially my bad. So, so it's difficult to find those other influences. I mean, there were other very minor thinkers by our standards who were in touch with Naoroji, economic thinkers at Oxford and Cambridge, but not the classic example, of course, is with Hobson. Hobson and Naoroji were living in the same city, and Hobson was, of course, writing this treatise on imperialism, and economics. They did not seem to be in correspondence with one another, which is shocking, right? I mean, living in the same city, having so many ideas in common, how could you not be in correspondence with one another? Unless they just deliberately destroy the correspondence or whatever. So it's difficult to trace many of those other lineages of economic thought. In terms of the second question you asked, with how this money was transmitted, we don't really know, or at least I haven't found that info as yet, because it was done very deliberately in a very secret manner. So again, I don't know if you were on the call when I showed that particular letter where it's saying, ask K to ask T to send 50. It was done in a very deliberately vague manner. So just in case someone else read it, they wouldn't know what the hell was going on. So I don't know precisely how that took place. I get a sense because, so I'm writing another paper right now that's looking at how Parsis conducted philanthropy in Iran in the 1880s. And one very interesting thing I find is how money was transmitted. So, money would be raised in Bombay and it would be sent to Yazd in the center of Iran, right? How do you get Indian rupees to Yazd? Well, it's very complex. You go through a bank and say Bandar Abbas or Bushehr. Oftentimes you go through the British legation, the British ambassador, and there's like a note of accreditation given to the person, and money is exchanged thereafter. So perhaps money was being exchanged this way. Since princely states might have had a bit more leverage to go outside of the bounds of the imperial financial system. Quite likely, again, they're probably just transmitted to a bank in London, which then takes a huge percentage, perhaps 25% off the value, pockets it, and gives the remainder to Naoroji. Unfortunately, in absence of material bank records, I just don't know.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Murari. Murari, you can go ahead, ask a question.
Thanks. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And I think I've not yet read your book, but I should do it soon. I was wondering, obviously there are many negatives associated with empire and imperial exploitation that we know of, and obviously Dadabhai Naoroji wrote indicting the British colonial rule, but it also created a more integrated world in which individuals like Naoroji could move around and take up the causes, which can even be at odds of the empire in general. So how do you bring in this aspect of the age in which people could correspond globally, and such people could get opportunity to rise to such a level to become truly global figure and take up the causes globally, some causes from different parts globally. So I'm sure this must be there in your book, but I just thought.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? In the sense that, before email, before really the telegram, before an era when chances are your letter would actually arrive rather than sinking somewhere off the coast of South Africa, people were in such detailed correspondence with people around the world. And I think to answer your question, we have to realize that this level of close correspondence obviously goes back much earlier, right? In the sense that, Ramohan Roy was in correspondence with people in Boston in the 1820s, direct correspondence. He was he was so well known in Spain that, the Spanish Cadiz constitution was dedicated to him in second publishing in the 1820s, right? So, the world was more globalized than we think in many ways. Now, of course, it took a long time to get your letter, and chances are you may not have got that letter at all. And this comes up a lot in correspondence. a lot of the correspondence I saw was along the lines of, I didn't receive your last letter. I can't read your last letter. Your telegram did not come through, or the British person who was transmitting my telegram misspelled all the Indian words I used, and therefore, whatever message I give to you is garbled. In spite of all this, they managed to do it. I mean, it says a lot about the persistence of these people. One thing I talk about in the book is how, really, in many ways, the Congress was in its early decades a transnational movement. When they put together a report of the Congress, they do it from not just multiple cities but multiple continents. Hume might be in Great Britain, Naoroji is in London also, but the other people are in Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and they're all corresponding with each other. It takes several months, but eventually they put it out. How do they do this in spite of, again, more dependable communication? It is a bit of a mystery. I guess, the one thing we can say, though, is that, again, if you are an Indian who can speak English and speak English well and can actually convey a lot of intellectual points in a manner that, is thought of as being unique and such, you obviously can go much farther than you obviously can today, right? When there's just so much competition and, there are millions of us who are competing for different things. People like Naoroji were unique, right? In the sense that, he was able to gain so much access in a way that, a contemporary like us today would have difficulty doing that, right? To be utterly frank, right? The world was a less competitive place in some ways. Of course, it was more disadvantaged for an Indian because of all the racism and colonialism and such. But there are ways that Naoroji was able to navigate around these barriers and somehow rise to the top. But for every person like Naoroji, there were others, again, who it didn't work that well. Again, Lal Mohan Ghosh is a good example. He was in many ways as qualified as Naoroji. He was as good of a speaker. He had ties with many important British politicians like John Bright, and yet he disappears from the political stage by around 1887, 1888. Evidently quite a bitter man, because of his experiences.
Thank you so much for that. We have a student question from a student, and perhaps this will be the last. Maybe I can take the advantage of my position as the moderator to ask one, but that will be the last question. Yes,
Sure.
Muskan, please.
I also had a question related to Dadabhai Naoroji and Karl Marx, actually. So I'm a third year entrepreneurship student, and I have to tell you my knowledge of history is actually somewhat messed up. My question was that how are they related? Was it just that Dadabhai Naoroji, told Karl Marx about the situation in India, or was he influenced by Karl Marx as well to some extent? Because as far as I know, any Marxist would despise the idea of nationalism and call it a bourgeois tool by the bourgeoisie class to maintain their bourgeois state and all these things. But there was also a point in the Principles of Communism by the Q&A by Engels that in countries which were not yet independent at that time, the first there has to be a capitalist revolution where the freedoms movement happens, and then a socialist revolution. So what was Dadabhai Naoroji's ideology exactly? Was he very well into working for, was his ideology and work more for people who are from the marginalized communities and working class in India, or was it for overall India in general, as in nationalist or proletarian type?
That's a great question. So the short answer to your question is that all the dynamics that we now have, the communist leftists, that as we view them in India, and their relationship with say like a nationalist or whatever, that's a relatively recent vintage, right? In the sense that probably only really develops after World War I. This kind of like Indian communism within India. Yes. So this is the 1880s in comparison. So it's a very different dynamic. Naoroji was a socialist in the sense that he believed that the government should have a degree of control and regulation of capitalism, but he wasn't a communist. He wasn't someone who believed in, the total, and classic communism, of course, is very different from, say, what current day communists in India might think of as. It's complex. I mean, as many things with politics are. But, people like Marx and Engels were actually very interested in India. Not just from the standpoint of, the British colonial connection, but, just what it tells us about capitalism in general, right? I mean, so when Marx is writing that particular letter, which I mentioned, he's talking about how, obviously Marx's main point is that capitalism is exploitative, right? And that it hurts, the working class. And, this drain theory appealed to someone like Marx because it was an example of how colonialism, which was, linked to capitalism, British capitalism in this case, was making a group of other people completely separate from the British economy, at least the British domestic economy, very poor. So that was an example again of capitalist exploitation. And one could go on in details, but I won't bore you about that, about the particular mechanisms. But that's how India really interested someone like Marx, right? Marx had his own prejudices about Indians, as he did with other people. He was still, he's a remarkable thinker in many ways, and far more, forward-minded than many other people of his era. But it was in that specific context. Now, as to your question of who was Naoroji really interested in, kind of like a bourgeoisie or proletariat, it's again a complex question in the sense that Naoroji was very pro-workers in Great Britain. So he went to union activities. He talked to people who were striking. He supported strikers. He was in favor of things like an 8-hour workday. He was in favor of things, like labor courts, which, special institutions where, labor would be given greater power vis-a-vis capitalists. But the one thing that was very striking in my opinion, is that he says very little about working conditions in India. Once or twice there are references here and there to workers in India. So most of his interest was actually on workers' conditions in Great Britain. He has far less to say about workers in India. There are a few reasons why. I mean, first of all, his reason for really trying to speak to a lot of workers in Great Britain is to get their votes, right? I mean, so Indian workers are not going to give them his votes, right? Because they can't vote. And the second reason is because the working class, the industrialized working class in India at this time was extremely small, percentage-wise. It was by and large a little bit in Bombay, a little bit in Ahmedabad, a little bit in Calcutta, not much else, right? So this changes by the end of Naoroji's career, by the early 20th century. But I did find it striking that he spoke very little about workers' conditions in India. And I'll just say something extra. In relation to that, nationalism eventually, by the 1920s, develops a very strong element on things like caste and the idea of helping lower caste people, which of course blends in with a general idea of helping the most disadvantaged people. In Naoroji's political writing, there's hardly anything about caste. It is just a glaring absence. Yeah. He makes a few references here and there to the lower orders, the less well off, but perhaps as a Parsi, we don't really have castes, and perhaps as someone who is so removed from India for so long, caste was just not in his mind to the same degree as it was, say, like a contemporary like Gokhale. So that's another way which the nationalism of that era was just massively different from, say, what nationalism is like we think of in Gandhi's era, or even whatever the nationalism that we think of what's going on today is like.
Right. No, I think that is exactly what my question was about, that because you also mentioned the idea of the African-American literature also getting inspiration from, or activists also getting inspiration from Naoroji. And now we see that there is an equivalence being drawn about caste and race. Yeah. In both the countries, and therefore I was also wondering that whether caste figures, because also Elphinstone College, we know that Ambedkar taught in Elphinstone College, so he's also part of that alumni of that glorious tradition. So definitely, and I was expecting something like this, that caste would not be featuring much. So I think in the interest of time, there is another question, but I think because we have already exceeded 5 minutes, so in the interest of time, I would like to thank you and so much. This was such a fascinating and very engaging conversations that we have had. Thank you so much, Dinyar, for this wonderful lecture and for this wonderful, very, very very good insights about Dadabhai Naoroji. And I think what just stands out from today's talk is, again, how I began that despite when you said that Congress was actually a transnational entity, or, the history was being written from so many different continents. And even despite Naoroji's connections in Britain, in several other places, the Indianness would not be questioned. And I think that is something which is a good message for today's times, that we can take from learning, about such historical figures. Thank you so much. With that, we would like to conclude this event. And thank you so much, Dinar. And thank you to all the participants for taking your time out today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to Sarthak, to Suchi, and to everyone else at Ahmedabad University for inviting me. It's been a pleasure talking to you all.